All right, so you guys have studied, all right, be quiet. So first of all, you guys studied ecology at some point in elementary school. You guys talked about, I know you studied food webs, food chains, probably talked a little bit about pollution and some things. So we'll be covering a bunch of those things and getting into much more detail. Like I said, this is our last year, and it's kind of two parts. In the first part, we'll talk about really the science of ecology, and then in the second part, we'll talk more about environmental issues, environmental problems. So ecology is a science. It's what I studied in college. We have in New Hartford at the high school, you could take a course in ecology, probably your junior or senior year if you wanted. We also have AP Environmental Science, which is pretty similar, sort of covers some ecology as well. So it's a topic you can learn more about as we move forward. But ecology is the science in which we study living things, but also their non-living environment around them. Study both of those things. Now, if we're just studying living things only, we would call that biology usually. And so ecology studies those living things as well as all the things around them, the non-living parts of their environment that they interact with. So I know a lot of you said you weren't sure about ecosystem. I asked that question before. And ecology studies ecosystems. And an ecosystem is an area, the living things and the non-living things all interacting with each other, all influencing each other. So ecosystems can be very large. You could think about an ocean ecosystem, which is huge, a desert ecosystem. But ecosystems can also be small. You can think about our courtyard of the school in the middle. That's its own little ecosystem. It has a bunch of living organisms, has non-living factors that are important to it. That's considered an ecosystem as well. Even things as small as like a tiny little puddle is its own ecosystem. Has little protists living in it, tiny little plants possibly, the water. So it varies from really big to really small. But we can consider all of those enclosed areas of living organisms in their environment ecosystems. So we have a bunch of terms we're going to talk about. When we're thinking about an ecosystem, we often will talk about the ecosystem community. And when we talk about the community, we're talking about all of the living organisms there in that ecosystem. If we think about the courtyard, the community would include the pine trees and the birch trees, the grass, the dandelions, the squirrels out there, the worms, the bacteria, the fungus. Basically, everything that's alive is a part of that community. If you're imagining, you can think about like your neighborhood. If you think about your home, where you live, is like an ecosystem. The people, the pets, and so forth, living in your neighborhood would be like the community. The habitat is sort of the area where the organisms live. You could think like the houses and the roads and so forth in your neighborhood. When we're studying ecosystems, often we'll talk about specific populations within that ecosystem. So when we talk about a population in ecology, we're talking about one specific species. It has to be a single species. Like if I say all of the plants in the courtyard, that's not a population. But if I said all of the eastern white pine trees in the courtyard, that is a population. because that's one specific species. If I say all the frogs in a pond, that's not a population. But if I say the bullfrogs in the pond, that is, because that's a specific species, bullfrog. And one important factor that we think about when we're talking about ecology often is the diversity of an ecosystem, or the biodiversity. And some ecosystems have a very high biodiversity, and what that means is they have lots of different types of living things in that ecosystem. The diversity is the number of different species. Now, our courtyard ecosystem does not have a high diversity. There's not that many different types of living things out there. Over the April break, I got to visit one of the ecosystems that has the highest diversity of any ecosystem on Earth. You know what it is?
Rainforest.
Yeah, the tropical rainforest. In Costa Rica, we spent a lot of time in the rainforest. In the rainforest, it's an area where there's plenty of moisture, there's intense sunlight, and it's an ecosystem when you have just a huge variety of plants and animals in a small area. The tropical rainforest is one of the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. So as we imagine an ecosystem like, say, the courtyard, we can think about it in terms of two things: the biotic factors in that ecosystem and abiotic factors. Do you know what the prefix bio means? Luke?
Life.
Yeah, it means life. Like biology is the study of life. Biotic factors are living things. If I look at this ecosystem pictured on the bottom of the slide, biotic factors would include the turtles and the deer and the cattail plants, the ferns, the trees, the grass. Even things like the bacteria living in the water, the protists. Those are biotic factors. Those are things that are alive. Do you know what it means when you put the letter A before a word?
Not living.
Yeah, it means not. And so abiotic factors are non-living things. Well, what would be a part of this ecosystem that's not living? John?
The log.
The log that's no longer living? Savannah?
The water.
The water? Is there anything else you can think of? Maybe not even things you can't see. Michael?
Air.
The air in this area, yep. The soil, the rocks, but also things like the temperature, the amount of oxygen in the water. Even though those aren't like things, those are important factors, because if those things change or if they were different, then you might not be able to support the same biotic factors. So biotic factors and abiotic factors are always influencing each other. The plants are releasing oxygen during photosynthesis. That changes the environment. The animals are releasing carbon dioxide. So there's lots of interactions between these living and non-living factors. So we already said, what would this dead log be? Abiotic. So these ecosystems on Earth, they all rely on the sun for their source of energy. Just about every single one. In fact, everything on Earth, all the energy can be traced back to the sun. Even the foods that we eat can be traced back to the sun. The sun's the source of all energy in an ecosystem on Earth. So, some organisms can use the sun's energy directly. Like what? What am I talking about? Brandon? Plants. Producers, you might call it. They are able to use the sun's energy to make their own food. They don't need to eat any other organisms. What process do we call that? Ethan? Through photosynthesis. Does anyone remember another word for a producer? It means self-feeding. Jenna?
Autotroph?
Yeah, good. Autotroph. Producers are also called autotrophs. Auto means self, troph means food. So we have our producers in an ecosystem, and then we have usually consumers. How can we define a consumer? Ava?
Like a user,
Of what? What do they have to do?
take stuff,
Yeah, specifically what?
energy.
Sort of. They have to eat other organisms. So consumers, they can't use the sun's energy directly. In order for them to get energy, they need to eat other organisms. We are all consumers. All animals are consumers. What's the other term for them? Savannah?
Heterotroph?
They're called heterotrophs. They have to eat other organisms in order to get energy. Then we have a special type of consumer called a decomposer. What does it mean for something to decompose, Grace?
To break down.
Yeah, to break down. Decomposers are the organisms that break down dead organisms, you know. The squirrel dies out in the courtyard, it's not going to be there for that long. Eventually it's going to disappear. And the reason it disappears is it decomposes, it breaks down. And it does that because there are bacteria and fungi that consume it. And they act as sort of recyclers because they return the nutrients that were present in that dead squirrel and return them back into the ecosystem. So we usually think of fungi and bacteria as the main decomposers in an ecosystem. So do we get our energy directly from the sun? Do we get it indirectly from the sun?
Yes.
Yeah, every single food that we eat, you could trace it back to energy that came from the sun. Okay, if you eat, let's see, you eat a piece of toast, are you getting energy from the sun?
Yes.
Yeah, because what is toast made out of?
Right.
Wheat. It's made out of flour, which is made out of wheat. What is wheat? A plant. A producer gets its energy from the sun. Even if you eat chicken. Well, how does chicken relate to that?
Chicken. Because chicken.
What do chickens eat?
Oh.
They eat seeds.
Seeds, grain, which came from plants, which got their energy from the sun. So, oftentimes when we're looking at an ecosystem, we want to see how energy is moving through that ecosystem. And we do that using food chains and food webs. A food chain basically shows how energy moves from one organism to another through the ecosystem. You know, you guys have seen food chains and probably drawn them before. Basically, it shows the predator-prey relationships in an ecosystem. It shows what eats what. And all ecosystems must start with what in their food chain?
Right.
Start with a plant. You can't have an ecosystem without producers. So let's look at an example. Let's say we have a wheat plant. growing in a field. Where does it get its energy?
Sun.
The sun. We don't include the sun in a food chain because it's not an organism. It's not a living thing. And then we draw arrows to show how the energy is moving from one organism to another. So let's say a mouse eats that wheat. Energy went from the wheat to the mouse.
It becomes a rat.
And then let's say a snake eats that mouse. Energy went from the mouse to the snake. And then an eagle eats that snake. The arrows are showing how the energy is moving in this ecosystem. So what would we call the wheat?
Wait, that's just a cricket.
Brandon? That's a producer. What do we call everything else? The rest of these things are consumers. All animals are consumers. And we actually label them with what level consumer they are. So the mouse, the first thing that eats the plants, is a first level consumer. Then the snake, the second level consumer. Eagle is the third level consumer. And we could continue. Usually there's not more than 4 levels. What level consumer am I? I'm a first level consumer.
What? I can eat all those. Oh, yeah. No. What if we ate like a hamburger?
I am a first level consumer. You most likely are a second level consumer.
I'm the first one.
So when you eat chicken or beef or pork, you're eating animals that ate the grains directly. Most of the time you're not, most of the foods that we eat, or you guys eat, if you're not a vegetarian, you're usually a second level consumer. Not often are you a third level consumer. Unless sometimes certain fish that you eat are higher up in the food chain. You know, if you eat tuna, that's higher up in the food chain. But most of our domestic agricultural animals are first level consumers.
What would a bee get?
First level consumer. So again, here we have a little bit of a different food chain. We have grass, cricket, mouse, snake, and eagle. So there's been a level added. So what level consumer is the snake in this one?
Third.
In this case, it's a third level consumer.
Oh, wow.
We have an extra layer added in there.
I just saw something I didn't want to see. I don't.
All right, we have some other
Maybe I don't like
terms that we use as we're talking about these organisms.
Oh, that's sad. That's upsetting. All he wanted was a carrot.
All right, so I think probably you guys know most of these terms. So raise your hand if you could tell me, what is, these are some specific definitions as we talk about food chains, food webs. What is an herbivore? Raise your hand if you can tell me. On air from some new individuals. Claudia. Yeah, it's an animal that eats only plants.
I don't.
They are always first level consumers. I am an herbivore. Most of you are in another group. So then, raise your hand if you can tell me what a carnivore is. A carnivore. Alex? No, that's a cannibal. Rihanna? What? Yeah, carnivore is an animal that eats only meat, eats other animals. Those are usually, they're always second or third or higher level. Some dinosaurs were herbivores, some were carnivores. So most of you are in this third category, omnivores. You know, raise your hand if you can tell me what an omnivore is. Raise your hand. Michael? Yeah, these are animals that eat both plants and meat. In an ecosystem, we can talk about the predator and the prey. The predator being the thing that hunts other organisms. And the prey is what got hunted, what got eaten. And then finally, a couple last definitions. A heterotroph. What is it? I know, that's why you should know. What is a heterotroph, Nigella? Yeah, it eats other organisms. They cannot make its own food. They're also called consumers. Autotrophs can make their own food. Autotrophs go through the process of photosynthesis. No. Definitely. All right. We got one more slide we got to get to. So what we've looked at so far are what we call food chains. A food chain shows one organism which eats another, which eats another, which eats another. However, that's not that realistic. In most ecosystems, there are multiple food sources. Most things don't just eat one single other animal. They eat multiple things. And a food web helps us to show that. So this is an example of a food web. It's not just a direct line from one organism to another. It's made of interconnected food chains. For example, one food chain might be wildflowers to mouse to hawk. That's one food chain you could find in this food web. Another one might be grass, rabbit, snake, hawk. That's another food chain. So from this food web, we could find several other food chains. Now, if we imagine an ecosystem, let's say we have this one. We have grass, crickets, mice, and owls. Those 4 species. Which would you expect there to be the most of? You could imagine that ecosystem. Would there be the most owls or crickets or mice or grass?
Grass.
Yeah, definitely grass. There would be far more grass than any of those other things. What would probably be the second biggest group? The crickets. And third? The mice or the rats. And fourth? The owls or eagles. So when we have an ecosystem, we always see this pattern. There's always the most producers, and as we go up the food chain, we get fewer and fewer of those organisms. So we show this in these pyramids. These are called energy pyramids. They show that each step along the way, up a food chain, there's less and less energy available. And there's a reason for that. When one organism eats another, most of the energy it's consuming gets used up for it to stay alive, for it to run around, for it to maintain its body temperature, and so forth. Only about 10% of the energy that goes into an organism actually goes into making it grow larger or allowing it to reproduce. So every time you have a step up the food chain, 90% of energy is lost, only 10% makes it to the next level. And that should make sense. You don't see, a flock of 200 owls, flying around. You don't see a school of thousands of sharks swimming together. Those are things that are top carnivores. They are very large. They require a very large area. There's not many of them. You don't see a herd of lions running through the savannah. You see 1 or 2. That's because they're top carnivores. There's not that many of them because it takes a whole lot of energy to support those top carnivores. Brandon? What's that? Yeah, so Brandon asked a good question. We can look at it 2 ways. If you have too many of the top predators, they'll eat the level below them, they'll exhaust it, and then that continues down the ecosystem. At the same time, if you don't have enough of the producers, you can't support enough herbivores, which can't support enough second level consumers, which can't support enough third level consumers. So you have to have that, those numbers have to work out in an ecosystem.